Lucas Harrow never believed in curses, but that changed the night he unlocked his family's forgotten house. His cousin Eliza had begged him not to go inside, warning him that the Harrow bloodline was marked, but Lucas laughed it off. The moment he stepped across the threshold, the air grew heavy, the walls whispered his name, and the carvings etched into the wood seemed to pulse like veins beneath skin. By the time Eliza arrived to check on him the next morning, all she found was the front door swinging open and fresh handprints, more bloody, and endless pressed against the walls inside. The first time I saw the house, I felt an unease I couldn't explain. It stood at the very edge of the village, gray and weathered, leaning into the trees as though it had been trying to sink into the forest for decades. My uncle had left it to me in his will, though I barely knew him. In truth, I barely knew anyone from my family's past. My parents never spoke of where they came from, never told me stories about childhood or ancestors. They kept their history locked away, and I had long stopped asking. Yet when the letter arrived, naming me the sole heir, I couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. I packed a bag and drove down to the village, wondering what secrets an old forgotten house could possibly hold. The village itself felt abandoned, though people still lived there. They avoided eye contact as I passed. Some even crossed the street, hurrying away like I carried some invisible sickness. When I asked for directions to my uncle's property, the shopkeeper's face tightened, and he muttered the words as quickly as possible, refusing to say more. It was strange, but I dismissed it, telling myself it was small-town suspicion of outsiders. Yet deep down, I wondered if it was something else, something heavier. Something they knew and I didn't. The house loomed larger with each step I took up the cracked path. Its windows were so dark they looked like eyes, staring down at me without blinking. The door groaned when I pushed it open, and a rush of stale, cold air wrapped around me, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and dust. The floor creaked under my feet as I explored, each room emptier than the last. But what caught my attention almost immediately were the walls. They weren't plain, not like normal houses. These walls were marked. At first I thought they were cracks or scratches from age, but when I leaned closer I saw symbols, strange, jagged carvings etched into the plaster, some shallow, others carved deep as if with furious hands. I ran my fingers over them and felt grooves that seemed deliberate. I didn't recognize a single shape. As evening fell, the light shifted through the broken shutters, and the carvings seemed to darken, their lines sharper, more visible. I told myself it was only a trick of shadow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were staring back at me in their own way. The weight of the house pressed down, heavier than any silence I'd known before. I tried to distract myself, unpacking the few things I'd brought, but the unease clung to me like cobwebs. By nightfall, I found a bedroom that seemed less broken than the rest. The floor sagged, but the bed frame was sturdy enough, and exhaustion pulled me down into it. I lay in the darkness, the air so still it felt suffocating. Sleep refused to come, my thoughts circling the carvings, the villagers' strange looks, the heavy silence of the house. That was when I heard the faintest sound beneath me. A soft scratching, like nails dragging across wood. At first I thought it was mice, but the sound didn't scurry or scatter. It moved slowly, deliberately, sliding along the floorboards under my bed, then across the room. My chest tightened. I held my breath, straining to listen, praying it would stop. But it didn't. The scratching circled the room, then paused beneath where I lay, directly under the bed. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. The sound returned, dragging across the boards until it reached the far wall, and then silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, every muscle locked. The silence was worse than the scratching. It made me imagine things, the thought of someone, or something, pressed against the underside of the floor, waiting. When I finally forced myself to sit up, the room was exactly as before. Shadows stretched long in the corners, the broken window rattled in the wind, and nothing moved. I told myself it was just nerves, an old house settling, nothing more. But even as I whispered it inside my head, I knew I was lying. Before I closed my eyes again, I noticed something in the corner. On the wall, where the carvings had seemed faint earlier, there was now one symbol deeper, darker than the rest. I could swear it hadn't been there before. It looked fresh, almost wet, as though someone had carved it while I lay in bed listening to the scratching. And in that moment, I realized the house wasn't empty at all. When morning came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My head throbbed and my eyes burned as though I had stayed awake the entire night. But I knew I had slipped in and out of uneasy dreams. I couldn't remember them clearly, only fragment shadows stretching across ceilings, faceless figures standing at the end of my bed, hands reaching for me but never touching. The memories vanished the moment I tried to hold onto them, like smoke between my fingers. I sat up, hoping daylight would make the house feel less suffocating, but instead I found something that froze me where I stood. The carvings on the walls were no longer faint. They had spread, stretching across plaster that had been bare the night before. At first, I thought it was a trick of exhaustion, but no, these marks were new. They gleamed faintly in the light seeping through the cracked shutters, like they had been freshly etched. My stomach twisted. I tried to tell myself maybe I just hadn't noticed them before, that the darkness had hidden them, but a part of me knew the truth. They were multiplying. I walked from room to room, hoping the rest of the house would seem normal, but the symbols were everywhere. In the hallway, along the stairwell, even on the ceiling above the front door. They weren't random scratches either. They were deliberate patterns repeating, curling into spirals and sharp angles that almost seemed to connect if I stared too long. The longer I looked, the more my head hurt, as if the shapes themselves pressed against my mind. I forced myself to turn away, to stop staring before I lost myself in them. I needed to get out, to clear my head, so I stepped outside. The village was quiet, too quiet. A few people stood in the distance, but when they saw me, they turned away as if they couldn't bear to look. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed in my direction before being hurried back inside. I felt like I was carrying something on me that only they could see. When I tried to approach one man near the well, he immediately gathered his things and walked off, his shoulders stiff, refusing to glance back. The rejection stung, but worse was the thought that they knew something about my house, my family, maybe even me that I didn't. By the time I returned, the afternoon light had already begun to fade. The house stood in silence, but the silence was no longer empty. It felt heavy, as though the walls were listening. I sat in the kitchen, trying to distract myself, but my thoughts circled the same fears. Why had my uncle left this house to me? Why had my parents never spoken of this place? What was this presence pressing on me with every breath I took inside these walls? When night finally came, the dread returned like a thick fog. The air grew colder, enough that my breath began to fog in the dark. I tried to sleep, but my body refused to relax, every sound magnified in my ears. That was when I noticed something new. The symbols on the walls weren't just carved, they glowed faintly under the moonlight, pulsing like veins alive beneath the surface. My chest tightened as I stared at them, the faint shimmer moving in rhythm, as though the house itself had a heartbeat. I shut my eyes, forcing myself to turn away, but sleep was no escape. The dreams came again, sharper this time. The faceless figures stood closer, their shapes clearer, long arms stretching, fingers twitching, bodies shifting as though they weren't solid. I woke, gasping, my sheets clinging damp to my skin. For a moment, I thought it was still the dream, until I noticed the window. Across the glass, faint handprints smeared the surface. They were small, too small to be an adult's, and they covered the entire window pane, overlapping each other like countless hands had pressed against the glass at once. My room was on the second floor. There was no balcony, no ladder, nothing anyone could climb, yet the handprints remained, pressed into the glass as though something had been clawing to get inside while I slept. I couldn't move, my breath caught in my throat, the room spinning as the truth settled in my mind. Whatever had left those prints wasn't outside anymore. I could feel it, somewhere inside the house with me, silent and waiting. And the worst part was the faintest sound I began to hear then scratching again. Not from beneath the floor this time, but from inside the walls, spreading closer and closer to where I lay. I couldn't face another night of lying in that room with the walls crawling around me. The moment dawn broke, I forced myself out of bed and began tearing through the house. I needed answers. There had to be some explanation hidden somewhere in this rotting place, something that would tell me what was happening. The unease that had stalked me since I arrived wasn't fading. It was growing stronger, pressing against me like an invisible weight. The attic drew my attention. The pull wasn't logical, but something inside me whispered that I would find what I was looking for there. The ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed, the stale air rushing down to greet me, thick with the smell of dust and mold. The space above was cluttered, shadows swallowing the corners. I swept my flashlight across old boxes, broken furniture, and piles of newspapers yellowed with age. Nothing unusual at first, until I noticed the chest. It sat in the far corner, half hidden beneath a moth-eaten sheet. Unlike everything else, it wasn't covered in dust. The wood looked worn but strangely preserved, as if someone had been opening it recently. My hands trembled as I pulled the sheet away and tested the lock. Rusted but still intact. I searched through drawers downstairs, until I found a small brass key on a string. Somehow, I knew it belonged to the chest. When the lock finally gave, the lid creaked open, and I found stacks of journals inside. Dozens of them, bound in cracked leather, pages yellow but thick, their edges curled with time. I lifted one carefully, flipping it open. My uncle's handwriting leaped out at me, frantic and messy, the ink blotched like his hand had been shaking as he wrote. The words chilled me. He spoke of a curse that clung to our family, passed down through blood, binding each generation to the house. He wrote of rituals, of sacrifices meant to keep something locked away. Page after page was filled with his fear pleas to anyone who might read them to continue what he could no longer manage. He wrote that the carvings were not random, they were seals, barriers meant to contain something old and hungry. He described it as a thing without form, living in the shadows, feeding on us, waiting for the bloodline to weaken so it could take more. The longer I read, the colder the attic became. My breath fogged in front of me, the chill creeping into my bones. One page in particular made me pause. The ink looked darker, thicker, and the smell was wrong, metallic. My stomach twisted as realization dawned it wasn't just ink. My uncle had written those words in blood. I shoved the journal back into the chest, my hands shaking violently. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run from the house, from the village, from everything. But when I stepped outside that afternoon and tried, I couldn't. The roads twisted in impossible ways. No matter which direction I drove, I circled back to the same crooked fence, the same sagging porch, the same looming windows. The house wouldn't let me go. Night crept in before I knew it, and with it came the sounds. Not the faint scratching I had heard before, but heavier, slower movements. I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart hammering in my chest as the noise traveled through the house. First on the stairs, each step groaning under weight that wasn't mine. Then across the hall, boards creaking under steady, deliberate pressure. It was walking toward me. I couldn't breathe. I told myself not to move, not to make a sound, but fear was screaming inside me. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Silence. My ears rang with the absence of sound, the kind of silence that pressed hard against you, demanding you listen. Then it came a slow, dragging sound, like nails scraping lightly against the wood of the door, tracing down from the top to the floor. I wanted to scream, to run, but I stayed frozen, my body locked by terror. The air was so cold, my teeth chattered as I sat there, listening, waiting for the door to open. But it never did. The sound stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. When morning came, I stumbled out into the hall, half expecting to see marks on the door. There were none. Everything looked untouched, normal, almost mocking. But when I returned to the attic to lock the journals away again, I found one lying open on the floor, though I was certain I had closed the chest. Across the page, scrawled in fresh, wet strokes, were words that hadn't been there before. Words written as though my uncle's frantic hand had reached through time to leave me a warning. It is awake now. You are the offering. I didn't sleep after reading those words. The phrase repeated itself in my mind, over and over, until it became a rhythm beating louder than my own heart. You are the offering. The more I tried to convince myself it was just my uncle's madness scribbled in a moment of despair, the more the house itself seemed to whisper otherwise. Every corner, every shadow, every groaning board reminded me that I was no longer a visitor here. I belonged to it now. I spent the day wandering from room to room, desperate to find some part of the house that felt normal. But the deeper I looked, the worse it became. The carvings that had once seemed confined to walls had now spread everywhere. They lined the wooden banister, crawled across the window frames, even twisted along the ceiling beams overhead. At times I could swear the lines shifted when I wasn't looking, bending, stretching, rearranging themselves into new shapes. My stomach turned whenever I caught movement in my peripheral vision, only to glance back and find stillness. The mirrors were the worst. There were several scattered throughout the house, cracked, dusty relics that I hadn't paid much attention to before. But now when I looked into them, my reflection wasn't right. At first, it was subtle. A tilt of the head I hadn't made, a blink that came a second too late. Then it grew bolder. My reflection grinned when I wasn't smiling, its lips curling too wide, teeth sharper than they should be. I smashed one of the mirrors with my fist in panic, the glass shattering into dozens of glittering shards. But when I turned away and glanced back, the pieces still reflected me, only not me. Each fragment showed my face twisted in a different way, eyes hollow, mouth open in a silent scream, skin pale and bloodless. I tried to cover the mirrors after that, draping sheets and blankets over them, but even hidden they unsettled me. I felt them watching, waiting for me to look again. By the time night fell, the house had grown colder than ever before. It wasn't just the chill of old wood and empty rooms. It was the cold of something unnatural, something that didn't belong in this world. My breath clouded in front of me as I sat huddled in the corner of the bedroom, trying to stay awake. That was when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, pressing into the floorboards as though something heavy was moving closer. I pressed my back against the wall, staring at the door. The sound stopped just outside, as it had before. I wanted to believe it would fade away, that it was just another trick of my imagination, but this time it didn't. Instead, a new sound followed, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like long fingers drumming against the wood. Tap, 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 each one sending jolts of fear through my body. When I finally dared to lean closer, my ear against the door, I realized the tapping wasn't random. It was matching my heartbeat. The longer I listened, the more it synchronized, until it felt like whatever stood on the other side was connected to me, its pulse blending with mine. I jerked away, trembling, and that was when I noticed the mirror across the room. I had covered it earlier, but the sheet had slipped to the floor. My reflection stood there staring back at me, only it wasn't seated in the corner where I was. It was standing upright, pressed close to the glass, its face almost touching the surface. Its hand slowly lifted, pressing against the inside of the mirror, leaving a wet, red smear that dripped down like blood. I couldn't breathe. I scrambled to my feet, knocking over a chair as I backed away. My reflection tilted its head, the grin stretching wide again, before lowering its hand. And then, slowly it lifted its other arm, gesturing toward the door where the footsteps had been. As if on command, the handle rattled. I froze, my eyes darting between the mirror and the door. The handle shook again, harder this time, as though someone or something was trying to force its way inside. I pressed my weight against it, my heart slamming against my ribs, but the strength pushing back was overwhelming. The wood groaned, hinges straining. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the pressure stopped. The house fell silent again. I sagged against the door, gasping for breath, my body trembling. But when I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone. The glass showed only the empty room. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was feeding on me. Every moment I spent inside its walls, the weight pressed heavier, like invisible hands sinking into my skin, draining something vital. My uncle's words, scrawled in his journals, echoed in my mind. The bloodline must feed it. The bloodline must feed it. I tried to escape again that morning, desperate to break free, but the village roads twisted in circles. No matter how far I drove, no matter which turn I took, I always ended back at the crooked porch. The house was a trap, and I was caught in its jaws. By midday, exhaustion blurred my thoughts. I stumbled through the hallways, half dreaming, half awake, unsure of what was real anymore. The symbols had taken over every wall, thick black lines that pulsed faintly like veins beneath skin. My eyes ached when I looked at them, but I couldn't help myself. They seemed to draw me in, whispering secrets I almost understood, words that brushed against my mind in a language older than anything I had ever heard. I covered my ears, but the whispering wasn't sound, it came from inside me, curling up from my blood, reminding me I belonged to it. That was when I found the cellar door. It was hidden beneath a heavy rug in the hallway, as if someone had wanted it kept secret. My uncle had mentioned it in passing in one of his journals, though I hadn't understood then. Seal the cellar, lock it tight, never go down unless the offering is ready. His frantic handwriting had seemed paranoid at the time, but now I realized he had been afraid of whatever lay beneath. My hand trembled as I pulled back the rug, revealing a thick wooden hatch with a rusted iron lock. But the lock wasn't old, it was newer than the house, newer even than the door. Someone had been determined to keep this place sealed. I should have walked away. Every instinct screamed not to touch it, not to open what had been hidden for so long, but the pull was stronger than my fear. It was as if the house itself guided my hand, whispering through the carvings, pressing me forward. I smashed the lock with a rusted hammer I'd found in the kitchen. The metal gave with a shriek, and the hatch groaned open. The air that rose up from the dark was thick and foul, carrying the stench of rot so strong I gagged. I lowered myself down the narrow stairs, the wood soft beneath my feet as though it might collapse. My flashlight beam cut through the black, illuminating walls slick with moisture. At the bottom, the light caught something that made me stumble back. Bones, piles of them, scattered across the dirt floor. Some were small, animal remains with gnawed edges. Others were unmistakably human, their skulls grinning through the dust. The bones were stained dark, as though soaked in something that had never dried. My stomach twisted violently, but I couldn't look away. In the far corner, a patch of wall was different, covered in thicker carvings, deeper symbols gouged into the stone. They seemed to pulse, almost breathing, as though something pressed against the barrier from the other side. Pinned to the wall was a final journal page, the paper curled in yellow. The ink was smeared, but I could still read it. I have failed. The offering is not enough. When I am gone, it will turn to the next. The bloodline must feed it, or it will take us all. The whispering grew louder, no longer faint but a roar inside my skull. My vision blurred as I dropped to my knees, the flashlight clattering to the dirt. Shadows rippled across the cellar walls, though there was no source for them. Something moved in the darkness beyond the carvings, pressing outward, its shape shifting and writhing like liquid. The stone bulged as though ready to crack. My skin prickled with cold and I felt a sharp sting in my chest, as if invisible fingers had hooked into me and were pulling something loose. I tried to run, but the cellar door slammed above me, sealing me in. The sound echoed like a death knell, final and absolute. My flashlight flickered, shadows swallowing the corners until the light went out entirely. I was trapped in pitch black, my breath ragged, the air thick with the stink of decay. And then I heard it, breathing, not mine, slow, steady, impossibly close. I backed against the wall, my hands scraping against the carvings. They burned hot against my skin, the symbols alive, branding themselves into my flesh. A voice rose from the darkness, not spoken aloud, but pouring straight into my mind. It wasn't my uncle. It wasn't anyone human. It was older, vast, endless. You are the blood. You are the door. You are the offering. I screamed, clawing at the walls, but the shadows surged toward me, cold and wet, wrapping around my arms, my throat, pulling me into the darkness. My body convulsed, pain tearing through me, as though my veins were being drained one by one. The last thing I saw before my vision failed was the carvings glowing bright red, pulsing like a heartbeat, faster and faster, until the cellar shook with it. And then, silence. I don't know if I died in that moment, or if I became something else. All I know is that the house feels emptier now, hungrier than ever. It waits for the next in the bloodline. It waits for them to come home, and when they do, I'll be here, in the dark, waiting to